Welcome everyone to our episode 79 of our podcast, Cultivating a New Generation. In today's episode, we are going to talk about a very polemic topic that maybe, I don't know, it depends on YouTube rules, can be a lot in terms of the regulations that many of these instances of health are giving, but this is just the science behind what is to oxygenate your brain to heal your body. So we are going to discuss how the oxygen that we are bringing and allowing into our body and the brain starts performing a lot of functions that have to do with repairing your brain, with maintaining the connections, with improving your learning skills, and also promoting your focus and concentration. And that's why we are seeing so priming effects, mainly in all the mental illnesses. To clarify this, I am not a physician. I am not a medical doctor. I am not prescribing anything. I am not recommending use or not use of certain things. I'm just showing you the facts, showing you the science, and explaining the biochemistry that is happening behind this oxygenation process. So, without further ado, I'm going to refer to the articles that I use to speak about this topic. And the first one is from the first author, Ogo, from 2019. The name or the title of this article is Interaction Between the Respiratory System and Cerebral Blood Flow Regulation from the Journal of Applied Physiology. The second article is from the author Van der Linden and is from 2021, The Neuroscience of the Flow State, the involvement of the locus coeruleus in the norepinephrine system. And I also have the article of what is happening with the mask and the regulations on the mask. Is a mask that covers the mouth and nose, free from undesirable side effects in everyday use and free of potential hazards. That's the polemic of this podcast, and we are going to go beyond the statistics and the many times the data that was presented by the mainstream media. So let's start with the mechanisms that govern the concentration of the ions in our body. Protons, which are the hydrogen ions, positive hydrogen ions, in the intracellular and extracellular fluids, which are especially important in the brain because of the acid-base transients that can influence neural activity by affecting various ion channels and or many enzymes, which are proteins that speed up reactions, metabolic reaction specifically, and therefore the regulation of the pH, which is a value of how acid or basic is our body inside of us. And of course, it is also measuring how acid or alkaline is your blood, is vital from an homeostatic function. So in order to have a proper function of our brains, we need to have a regulation of these kind of ions because, as I mentioned, they open channels that are going to allow the introduction of minerals and many other products of that are necessary for their reactions, for the metabolic reactions, and that are going to be extremely important in terms of allowing you to have a proper connection of your brain. So the acid-induced decrease in intracellular pH are a normal consequence of the respiration process because the arterial CO2, which is carbon dioxide, the concentration in the arteries of this gas, of the CO2, can be mechanically altered by changes in ventilation and is considered a strong physiological influence for the pH of your whole body. So, for example, exercise can drastically increase CO2 production for active muscle metabolism. Thus, exercise-induced hyperventilation is possibly an important physiological mechanism to reduce CO2 concentration for maintaining the pH homeostasis during exercise. That's why also mainly when we are performing any kind of physical activity, we should have an open airway to breathe and to constantly interchange the gases that we are inhaling and exhaling so that we don't have any kind of resistance. We are going to speak about this resistance and how it affects also the proper flow of this kind of gases. Arterial CO2 concentration is mainly regulated by two feedback mechanisms or control systems, respiration and cerebral blood flow, which we are going to abbreviate as CBF. Notably, both of these systems are sensitive to the same mediator, which is CO2, at a set point. So we have a threshold or a set point where we are going to sense how much CO2 our body can withstand and how this CO2 has been changing also the pH of our body. Therefore, it is physiologically plausible that these systems are closely linked. The cerebral blood flow, the respiration, and the CO2 levels. So pay attention to this because this is extremely important. There exists an interaction between the regulatory system of respiration and the cerebral vasculature, which is characterized by responses to changes in CO2 concentration as a mediator. The regulation of the arterial CO2 concentration affected by respiration and CBF, the cerebral blood flow, may be a key factor in the clinical aspect. For example, it may be related to a rise in the risk of brain disease in the patients with respiratory dysfunction. After we are going to reach almost 3 years after these measures were installed everywhere in the planet, and many of these measures have been highly polemic because of these things, because of the science, because of how we know our body works, and many times it is just common sense. If you have a resistance here, you are not going to allow the control of the gases that you are inhaling and exhaling. So you are going to disrupt the CO2 homeostasis. Now it is recognized that the cerebral vasculature is sensitive to changes in the partial pressure of arterial CO2 and oxygen also. In many studies on this CBF regulation, blood flow velocity in the middle of the cerebral artery, which is going to be abbreviated MCAV, has been measured as an index of the anterior cerebral blood flow. This CBF responds to change in the arterial CO2 concentration, suppresses physiological decline or elevation of CO2 in brain tissue to maintain the pH homeostasis. I'm going to explain why this CO2 is changing the pH with a chemical reaction that we are going to discuss at the end of the episode. So stay tuned for the explanation and how we are going to see these kind of reactions that are going to control and regulate the velocity of how our cerebral blood flow is being regulated. The response of the CBF to changes in the pressure of CO2 is defined as cerebrovascular reactivity to CO2, and it is widely measured or analyzed in related research fields as one of the regulatory functions of cerebral circulation. For example, this CBR, this reactivity to CO2, indicates the cerebral microvascular hemodynamic function. So this means that this is another sensor that we have, and it is measuring how well, in terms of the pressure of the CO2, the concentration, and the pH, is flowing the blood inside of our brain. Imagine that kind of sensitivity that our bodies and brain have in order to detect the upregulated concentration of CO2 and how this is going to affect the pH and many metabolic reactions that we are going to discuss. For example, this CBR is impaired in many brain disorders, such as a stroke. Yes, you are listening correctly. You can have a stroke just by elevating the CO2 concentration because you are dysregulating this kind of speed cerebral blood flow. That's why Alzheimer's disease, you have a predisposition to have this kind of disease, and mild cognitive impairment. So your learning process is not going to function properly. This CBR is going to have many side effects. In recent studies, it has been reported that aging impairs the CBR. So this regulation of the cerebral function and the CO2 is extremely impacted by age. And if you are consuming more CO2, you are producing more degenerative stress in your body that is going to lead to aging. So this CBR also indicates indirectly that cognitive dysfunction is associated with aging increases the risk of developing dementia. You heard correctly. So what are the side effects of this regulation due to the pressure of CO2? Stroke, Alzheimer's disease, and mild cognitive impairment. Those are the three main side effects which are really, really permissive, and of course, dementia. In addition, these findings suggest that CBR plays an important role in the regulation of the CBF, cerebral blood flow, for brain function. And remember, cerebrovascular reactivity to CO2 is CBR. Okay, CO2 enters the blood vessel walls directly from the vessel lumen or the extracellular space. In the blood vessel, CO2 is going to be converted into H positive with this CO2 by a carbonic anhydrase, consequently decreasing the pH, which is the reaction that is going to occur. When this CO2 is combined with these protons, it is going to form a chemical compound that is going to function as a regulator or buffer system. Then the muscle tonus of the blood vessel wall changes by the decrease in pH, causing vessel dilation. So it allows to start flowing all of the blood and allowing more softness in terms of how this flow doesn't have resistance. But if we have too much CO2, what is going to happen? This enzyme is going to arrive to a saturation point, and this reaction is not going to occur, and then we don't have a regulation of the pH, so the acidity of our blood and our system. Respiratory dysfunction alters various physiological factors. The respiratory dysfunction alters various physiological factors. Why did I repeat that? Because many people right now still have, because of the extensive use of these masks, this regulation in the respiratory function. So in addition to arterial CO2 concentration, which is called technically acute hypocapnia and hypercapnia, for example, the attenuation of respiratory function is accompanied by oxidative stress. You heard correctly, you are oxidating your body. That means also aging. Enhancement of the sympathetic nerve activity, which is SNA, and attenuations of the baroreflex, which measures the pressure, and endothelial function, and decreases in stroke volume, so decreases in venous return. So the oxygenation is going to be this function. The alteration of these physiological factors is caused by respiratory dysfunction, which also influences the cerebral vasculature, as I mentioned also before. This research has been having a lot of data in terms of the physiological factors associated with the respiratory system on the CVF regulation. For example, another data and another real factor that is happening. Hypertension caused by high intensity resistant exercise exceeds the range of Ca around 50 to 160 milligrams of mercury, but the CVF tends to decrease. So when we are doing exercise, when we are performing these kinds of activities, and we have a proper ventilation, we don't have any problem because our body is going to have a regulation of these systems with the reaction, with the chemical reaction, with the sensors of the CO2, with the pressure, the baroreflex, and all of these mechanisms that we have integrated in our bodies. But when we are having a resistance and we are elevating in very high quantities the CO2, our bodies cannot work with that kind of concentration. So this indicates, all of these measures indicates that a strong cerebral vasoconstriction due to an enhanced activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which is the one that is being activated under stress, can occur whenever we don't have this proper ventilation process. The physiological significance of this SNA system or sympathetic activation, direct effects on cerebral vasculature may be to prevent cerebral overperfusion and consequently protect the blood-brain barrier during exercise-induced hypertension. That happens under exercise. But what happens when you are not exercising and just having a resistance? Similarly, the activation of this SNA or the sympathetic system, nervous system, drives the respiratory center. It causes hypocapnia, which is low concentration of CO2, via hyperventilation, consequently decreasing the cerebral blood flow. Thus, the sympathoexcitation indirectly affects the cerebral vasculature and decreases the CBF via the respiratory system. But this is just momentaneous, is extremely fast, and you return to your normal um, levels of the sympathetic activation and also to the normal levels of CO2 concentration. This is what your body is doing while performing exercise and under the proper conditions. So now we are going to analyze what happens when we have these measures that are recommending the use of the mask. Is a mask that covers the mouth and nose free from undesirable effects? We will see. In April 2020, the WHO World Health Organization recommended the use of masks only for symptomatic ill individuals and healthcare workers and did not recommend its widespread use. So that was the first recommendation. But what happens next? In June 2020, they changed this recommendation to endorse the general use of mask, which was a bad recommendation, in crowded places. And what happens? In a meta-analysis study commissioned by the WHO, so under their rules, under their guidelines, what happens because they did this study? There is no clear and scientifically graspable benefit of moderate or strong evidence of wearing the mask. That's a study, a meta-analysis produced by the guidelines of the WHO. So why people didn't have all this information? Who knows? That's for you to find out. While maintaining a distance of at least 1 meter showed moderate evidence with regard to the spreading of the virus, of the COVID virus, only weak evidence at best could be found for mask alone in everyday use in a non-medical setting. Another meta-analysis conducted in the same year confirmed the weak scientific evidence for masks. According to the WHO, they did not recommend general or uncritical use of masks for the general population and expanded its risk and hazard list within just 2 months. So, while in the April 2020 guideline highlighted the dangers of self-contamination, possible breathing difficulties, and false sense of security, the June 22 guideline found additional potential adverse effects such as headache, development of facial skin lesions, irritant dermatitis, acne, or increased risk of contamination in public spaces due to the improper mask disposal. So, what happens if we have secondary effects such as headache or skin lesions? What are the drug prescriptions that these people are going to either self-prescribe or they are going to be recommended by any kind of physician? Usually, they are going to take a lot of painkillers for the headache. Many of these are under crisis, and we know that they caused a very severe damage to the liver and to many of the addiction process in terms of these kind of pills that can be consumed without prescription. Now, what happens to the facial lesions for the use of the mask, excessive use of the mask? Well, these people are going to be recommended or prescribed to use any kind of cortisone, which is a glucocorticoid. And you know what happens with glucocorticoids if you review one or two episodes ago. So just pay attention and start linking the information. Glucocorticoids are disrupting completely your metabolic system. So you are not breathing well, you are having problems of dementia, you are having risk of a stroke, you are having risk of cognitive decline, you can have deficit of attention, of course, and as a gift, you are going to be consuming products to take your headache and to treat your facial skin lesions. So it is a rounded business, and you know for who. A total of 65 scientific papers on masks qualify for a purely content-based evaluation. This included 14 reviews and 2 meta-analyses of the mathematically evaluable, groundbreaking 44 papers with significant negative mask effects. 22 were published in 2020 and 22 published before the COVID-19 pandemic. Of these 44 publications, 31 or 70% were experimental in nature, and the remainder were observational studies, so 30%. Most of the publications in questions were in English, 98%. And remember here something important, 31 of these 44 publications, 70% were experimental. So they did something to prove the things. They were not just observing what happened. They were proving, testing the things. 30 papers refer to surgical mask, so that's 68%. 30 publications related to N95 mask, 68%, and only 10 studies pertain to fabric mask, 23%. Despite the differences between the primary studies, these people were able to demonstrate a statistically significant correlation in the quantitative analysis between the negative effects, side effects of blood oxygen depletion and fatigue in mask wearers. So, blood oxygen depletion, that means CO2 elevation also. Fatigue caused by this disruption of the process. As early as 2005, an experimental dissertation, which had a randomized crossover study, demonstrated that wearing surgical masks in healthy medical personnel, which was 15 subjects from ages 18 to 40 years old, leads to measurable physical effects with elevated transcutaneous carbon dioxide values after just 30 minutes. 30 minutes of using this kind of mask. The role of dead space, volume, and CO2 retention as a cause of the significant change in blood gases on the way to hypercapnia, which was still within the limits, was discussed in this article. Masks expand the natural dead space because you are not allowing the proper respiration process. What is the dead space? Nose, throat, and trachea bronchi. Outwards and beyond the mouth and nose. An experimental increase in the dead space volume during breathing increases carbon dioxide, CO2 retention at rest, and under exertion, and correspondingly the carbon dioxide partial pressure in the blood. So we are elevating the levels of CO2 and elevating the partial pressure of CO2 in the blood. as well as addressing the increased rebreathing of carbon dioxide. We are recycling our own CO2. That's why we are increasing, even thermally, even in the skin, the amount of CO2 by increased breathing resistance when using these masks. According to scientific data, mask wearers as a whole show a striking frequency of typical measurable physiological changes associated with masks. The increase of this rebreathing of CO2 from the enlarged dead space volume in mask wearers can reflectively trigger increased respiratory activity with increased muscular work from your thoracic part, as they result in additional oxygen demand and oxygen consumption. This is a reaction of pathological changes in the sense of the anadaptation effect. So it is not the same to adapt to a low ventilation space in terms of a gym or an office or something that you are just going to be a little moment in that place than having this resistance every day. Imagine what is the damage to the children. Just imagine that. A mask-induced drop in blood oxygen saturation value or the blood oxygen partial pressure can in turn additionally intensify subjective chest complaints. Experiment shows an increase in airway resistance by a remarkable 126% on inhalation. Imagine 126% you have a resistance in just inhaling air, and 122 on the exhalation process with an N95 mask. Experimental studies have also shown that most duration of the mask, because when you breathe, sometimes you can have some moisture in your mask, or when you speak, sometimes you have some drops of saliva, or when you sneeze and you have the mask, whatever it is the reason, that increases the resistance of breathing by a further 3%. So more or less, you are increasing almost 130% your resistance to breathing. And thus, with these kind of numbers, you can increase the airway resistance up to 2.3, 2.5 times the normal value. This clearly shows the importance of the airway resistance of a mask. And here, the mask acts as a disturbance factor in breathing and makes the observed compensatory reactions with an increase in breathing frequency and simultaneous feeling of breathlessness plausible. That's why many people also have a very now low resistance or withstand to just climbing stairs or just walking. And many times they just feel agitated by those kind of exercises because under almost 3 years of wearing a mask, imagine what is going to happen. This extra strain due to the amplified work of breathing against bigger resistance caused by the mask also leads to an intensified exhaustion. So your energy is being depleted because oxygen is essential for many of the metabolic reactions which are going to give you energy. All of the energetic metabolic pathways demand oxygen. So we need more oxygen, not less. And if we have CO2, that CO2 competes with the oxygen. So you don't have too much oxygen and you have too much CO2. CO2 is going to compete with oxygen. So Just do the math. Fittingly, in this review of the studies and in this meta-analysis of the side effects of mask, these people, these researchers, also found a percentage of clustering of significant respiratory impairment and a significant drop in oxygen saturation. And what is going to happen if you are under oxygen saturation most of the time, most of the days, because of the excessive use of this mask? Well, your brain is not going to work. Your body is going to be feeling fatigue. You probably will have a headache. You probably will have skin lesions. You will probably have cognitive damage. You will probably develop dementia. You will probably be more predisposed to Alzheimer. Those are the consequences. Those are the results. The articles are there. I read the name of the articles and they are free to the public. So you can look for this kind of information if you need to go beyond. So now let's look at the reactions of what is happening inside of your body. We are going to see what is happening here. Look at this graphic. This is cerebral blood flow. As we increase the cerebral blood flow, we should have a much better response to oxygen instead of the CO2. But what is happening to the partial pressure of arterial carbon dioxide or oxygen tension? If we have more CO2 due to the fact that we are wearing the mask too much time, the partial pressure of the CO2 is going to increase. So as we increase, the response of oxygen is going down and the response of CO2 is being elevated. This is going to affect the cerebral blood flow in terms of the oxygenation process. So your brain is not going to have oxygen. The cerebral vasculature is sensitive to changes in arterial pressure of CO2 and the pressure of oxygen, which is this graphic. In this diagram B, high CO2 is converted into this ion that is going to be a buffering system to regulate the pH. But if we have too much of this reaction is not being properly balanced. So the pH is not going to be regulated, and that is going to damage the cerebral vasculature, also increasing or triggering the concentration of all of these factors which are related to inflammation processes. And your cerebral blood flow is going to be affected, of course, and your lungs are going to be affected because of the pressure of the CO2 and the resistance that you are creating and the now low oxygenation process. Your lung system varies arterial CO2 via ventilation and consequently changes the blood pH rapidly. That's when we have normal concentrations of CO2. Also, the kidneys vary the amount of hydrogen excreted, and they are going to reabsorb this hydrogen from the reaction process. The kidney system changes the blood pH slowly. So this enzyme, that participates in this reaction, is going to allow the production of this buffering system. But the process of not becoming acid for your blood is slow. So change in pH alters the muscle tonus of the blood vessel wall, with transient receptor potential cation channel subfamily of this member TRBP, which is these factors, prostacyclin, PGE, nitric oxide, increasing or decreasing cerebral blood flow via vessel dilation or constriction. So this is the other sensors that we have, and these substances or these messengers are going to also dictate what needs to happen at dilation, because we don't have too much CO2 and we can flow of the oxygen, or the constriction because we have a lot of pressure and we are having resistance and we cannot flow properly the oxygen. So now, what is happening in your brain and your lungs? How do they control this system? Central respiratory chemoreflex, which means the reflex of the molecules, the chemical molecules, includes the two subsystems, neural control and of ventilation and lung-based gas exchange properties that maintain CO2 homeostasis through interaction via CO2 in a closed loop, which is all of this system. In addition, the respiration and cerebral blood flow regulatory systems may interact with each other because both systems are regulated by the same mediator, which is CO2. So if this cerebral blood flow is being affected by the amount of CO2, brain is going to have an activation process to the respiratory center, and there is going to be a signal of neural control ventilation. But if you don't have anywhere to obtain oxygen because you have a resistance, what is going to happen? This signal is not going to be properly met. So the lung gas exchange property that is going to signal the mediator of the arteries is not going to work. That's when you can have a real damage to your brain in terms of the cerebral vasculature, and of course that needs a lot of usage and a lot of time. That is what has happened everywhere. You can have a stroke, and this is just the science. This is just the regulation process that is happening. This is just the system, how it works. So pay attention to this, because we are damaging these kind of sensory systems by doing something that doesn't have any sense. So breathing resistance due to the mask, 180%, just because there is a resistance in all this dead space that is marked in gray. So it is more elevated, the CO2, and it is down regulating the amount of oxygen. Look at this with the N95 mask. Dead space volume increases in 80%. Dead space means you don't have a proper ventilation. The pathophysiology of the mask, important physical and chemical effects. This is what is happening with this resistance. When breathing, there is an overall significantly reduced possible gas exchange volume of the lungs of minus 37% caused by the mask, according to a decrease in breathing depth and volume due to the greater breathing resistance of plus 128%. So this is the exertion when inhaling greater than when exhaling. And due to the increased dead space volume of plus 80%, which is this one, which does not participate directly in the gas exchange and is being only partially mixed with the environment, what is going to happen? You're going to increase the amount of CO2 because you don't have oxygen. You are simply also not allowing the proper exchange of oxygen. So this is the whole science of the oxygenation of your brain, how we are damaging many sensors, many systems, many reactions, many metabolic processes, and we are having side effects such as the headaches, the skin lesions, cognitive impairment, attention deficit disorder, Alzheimer, focus concentration, depletion of your energy, and much more. Because if you have those side effects, you are going to consume something to alleviate those symptoms. So you are just creating a loop of consuming things that you don't really need. And the only consequence of that is this. So just analyze the information, watch it every number of times that you need to watch it to understand the science. And if you have any kind of questions, any kind of concerns, if you require the articles, you can ask me for the PDF articles. I will also add the links so that you download the articles and read them complete. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope that this information really helps you and helps many people to open their eyes to measures that make no sense. And these are just the data. I'm not a physician. I'm not recommending anything at all. I'm just showing you the facts. You decide for yourself. Thank you. Have a wonderful day, even though the day has gotten obscure. And I'll listen to you and see you on our next episode. If you like the information, remember, just send it, share comments, have some reaction so that these algorithms help us to expand this kind of information. Thank you and have a wonderful day. Bye.